get this, we're diving into a Cuban prison.
A Cuban prison.
Yeah, it's called La Condesa, and it's specifically for foreign inmates.
Oh?
And get this, it's filled with Canadians.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Today, we're going to try and figure out why so many Canadians are locked up there and what their lives are actually like behind those walls. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Sounds like a fascinating deep dive.
It is. It is.
So where are we getting our info from for this one?
Well, our main source here is this series of investigative articles from CiberCuba.
CiberCuba?
Yeah.
Okay.
They actually give us a pretty in-depth look into La Condesa between 2021 and 2022.
So pretty recent then.
Yeah, pretty recent stuff.
Yeah.
We're going to be hearing directly from these Canadian prisoners.
Okay.
And we're going to try to understand what landed them there and how the Canadian and U.S. governments are responding. What do they even do in a situation like this?
It's a good question, right? And I have to say, from what I read, these CiberCuba articles, they don't sugarcoat anything.
Really?
They describe La Condesa as overcrowded, unsanitary, and the food is just terrible. One inmate even compared the food to vomit.
Oh, gosh.
That's really
rough.
rough.
Yeah, it's rough.
And on top of that, they talk about limited access to medicine and unreliable utilities, like water and electricity.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
So are they, like, trying to hide all this stuff or something? I mean, why would...
Well, the articles mention prisoners being forced to paint the prison twice a year.
To, like, make it look nice?
Yeah, to make it look good for visiting embassy officials.
It's like a facade, you know?
It is. It's exactly...
Makes you wonder what else they might be trying to cover up.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely concerning.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's not just the big picture stuff like you're saying.
Yeah.
The details are really grim, too.
Like what?
Just think about this.
Huh.
One stove for all the cooking.
Seriously?
Yeah.
That's wild.
Toilets without seats and drinking water that comes from questionable 55-gallon drums. It's hard to even imagine trying to live in those conditions.
Gosh, it's more like a survival challenge than a prison, you know?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I get stressed if my internet's down for an hour. I can't even imagine what these prisoners are going through.
Especially with the added isolation from those COVID restrictions.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
You're right. It's just a recipe for both mental and physical distress.
Yeah.
A lot of the prisoners express serious concerns about their well-being and how these conditions are impacting their health.
It makes sense.
It does.
So, okay, let's talk about these Canadians.
Okay.
There are quite a few of them, right?
Yeah, there are quite a few. And they're all facing this whole range of charges.
Like what?
Well, you've got Velmelathan Adasu, Thabathoran Fababalesingam, and Sanjeeth Sundarling.
Wow, those are some names.
They were all accused of currency trafficking and forgery.
Okay, so financial crimes?
Right. Then there's Nabil Steven. He was involved in a fatal car accident.
Oh, wow, so that's a completely different...
Yeah, completely different situation. And then there's Simarjeet Butter, charged with corruption of a minor.
Corruption of a minor?
Yeah. So basically engaging in inappropriate behavior with someone under the age of consent.
Oh, I see.
It's treated very seriously in Cuba.
Okay. And what else?
And then we have Benjamin Tomlin, who was accused of sexual misconduct with a minor, although the alleged victim actually denied the accusations during the trial.
Oh, wow. So that's a little...
Yeah, that's a little strange.
Yeah, that definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah, but the validity of the charges for sure.
Yeah.
And then you have Raju Martin, who was sentenced for fraud in a trial he claims was completely staged.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that's a common thread with a lot of these prisoners.
Oh, so it makes you wonder if there's a pattern here, you know?
It does. It does.
Like, are these legitimate charges?
Yeah.
Or are they being used to target foreigners?
It's a good question, especially when you consider cases like Stephen Purvis and Systok Makjian.
Oh, yeah, those are the businessmen, right?
Right. They invested heavily in Cuba.
Yeah.
Only to be detained and have their assets seized by the government.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it really raises questions about how the Cuban legal system operates, particularly when it comes to foreign nationals.
Yeah, definitely.
And then to make things even more complicated, we have the case of Curtis Snyder, an American citizen.
Oh, right. There's an American in there, too.
Yeah.
What happened with him?
Well, Snyder was detained in December 2021 outside of Cuban waters.
Outside?
Yeah, which is interesting in itself.
Definitely.
He was accused of human trafficking.
Human trafficking? Wow.
Yeah, but he was held for 4 months without any legal representation. It's another example of how the legal process can be opaque and potentially unfair to those who are detained.
So we've got Canadians and Americans behind bars, accusations ranging from, financial crimes to serious offenses.
Right.
And this consistent theme of prisoners claiming they've been wrongly accused or denied a fair trial, it's a lot to unravel.
It is.
I mean, where do we even begin with this?
Well, we haven't even touched upon the case of Andriy Georgiev, a Bulgarian national who went on a hunger strike.
Oh, wow.
To protest what he called false documents about his health being given to the Bulgarian embassy.
Wow, that's serious.
It is. There's clearly a lot more to unpack here.
Yeah, so, okay, we're starting to see this picture emerge here, right?
We are.
Harsh prison conditions, questionable legal practices, and now we have to figure out how the Canadian and U.S. governments are dealing with all of this. What are they doing to help their citizens?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
We're going to have to get into that. It's heartbreaking, to hear these Canadians talk about their experiences.
Yeah.
Many of them are pleading to be transferred back to Canada,
To serve out their sentences.
Yeah, to serve their sentences. And they keep referencing this treaty.
Oh, really?
Yeah, between Canada and Cuba that allows for prisoner transfers. But
so why don't they just do it then, if there's a treaty?
well, it's not as simple as it sounds.
Okay.
Apparently, there are a lot of legal hurdles, conditions that need to be met. And to be honest, some experts believe that Canada might be a little hesitant to utilize this treaty.
Oh, wow.
Well, because they don't want to appear to be giving in to pressure or even legitimizing what they might see as unfair detentions. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see.
It's like this.
A diplomatic.
Yeah, it's a diplomatic tightrope walk.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But what about the prisoners, right?
What about them? I mean, how are they dealing with all of this?
They're frustrated, incredibly frustrated.
Yeah.
From their perspective, it feels like the Canadian government just isn't doing enough to help them.
So they feel abandoned, basically.
Yeah, completely abandoned. They're stuck in this awful prison.
Yeah.
And they feel like their own government has turned its back on them.
That's tough.
It is. What are they saying specifically?
Well, there are a couple of things that they are particularly upset about.
Like what?
First, they don't trust this Cuban citizen.
The one who was appointed?
Yeah, who was appointed by the Canadian embassy to handle their cases.
Oh, so they don't have anybody really advocating for them?
No, not really. They feel like their concerns aren't being taken seriously.
Oh, it's terrible.
And on top of that, they see other foreign nationals from countries that don't even have extradition treaties with Cuba
Really?
being released or transferred while they remain stuck in La Condesa.
It's almost like they're being penalized for being Canadian.
It is. It is. It feels like Canada isn't fighting for them as hard as other countries are for their citizens. And you mentioned before about the U.S. State Department confirmed they were providing consular assistance to Curtis Snyder.
That's right.
So it seems like the U.S. is taking a little bit more of an active approach, right?
They are. And this whole situation really exposes these complexities of diplomatic leverage and, in international relations.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Well, basically, countries use their relationships and their influence to negotiate and to try to achieve their goals.
Okay.
And in this case, the question is, how much leverage does Canada actually have with Cuba?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And are they willing to use it to help these prisoners?
I see what you mean. Yeah.
It's really interesting because Canada spearheaded this initiative that was signed by 58 nations.
Really?
To prevent exactly what these prisoners are experiencing.
What do you mean?
The detention of foreign nationals for diplomatic gain.
Wow, that's ironic.
It is. They were trying to establish this international norm against using people as bargaining chips.
So, they're not really upholding the thing that they helped to create.
Well, it's a tricky situation, right?
Yeah.
Because they're trying to uphold this principle
Right.
while also trying to secure the release of their own citizens.
It's like a catch-22.
It is. Really is.
And we also have to consider the impact of those sonic attacks.
Oh, right.
On the Canadian embassy in Havana,
Yes.
That whole incident, it really strained diplomatic relations, right?
Yes, it did.
Led to reduced staff at the embassy. So you have to wonder if that's affecting their ability to provide adequate consular services to these prisoners.
Yeah, it's definitely a factor to consider.
Yeah.
And then you have these cases of those Canadian businessmen like Stephen Purvis and citing who were detained and had their assets seized.
Right. Yeah.
These high-profile incidents,
Yeah.
they further complicate the relationship between the two countries.
So it's kind of like this atmosphere of mistrust.
It creates this atmosphere of mistrust, and it makes it even harder to negotiate.
So we have these individual stories of Canadians trapped in this difficult situation.
Right.
But it's all playing out against this backdrop of diplomatic tension.
And uncertainty.
Yeah, it's like a tangled web with no easy way out.
It really is. You can't help but wonder
Yeah.
if countries like Canada are struggling to protect their citizens in places like Cuba,
Yeah.
who is ultimately responsible for ensuring their safety and fair treatment.
That's a really good question.
Is it even possible?
In a world with such complex international
I
relations,
don't know.
it's a tough one. It's tough. They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, they are.
A Cuban legal system that they don't trust.
Right.
And a Canadian government that they feel like has just abandoned them.
And you can really hear that sense of abandonment in their voices.
Yeah.
I mean, they feel so let down by their own government,
Yeah.
the very entity that's supposed to protect them when they're most vulnerable.
It's ironic when you consider what the Canadian foreign minister said,
Right.
about providing assistance to citizens abroad.
Right.
It sounds great on paper,
It does.
but it doesn't seem to match up with what these prisoners are actually going through.
It makes you wonder about that disconnect, right?
Totally.
That exists between the political rhetoric and the lived experiences of people on the ground.
Yeah, for sure.
It's one thing to say you'll support your citizens,
Right.
but it's another thing to actually navigate the complexities of a foreign legal system
Yeah.
and make sure they're treated fairly.
So if countries like Canada are facing these challenges in protecting their citizens abroad, what does that even mean for the average person?
That's a great question.
If we were to find ourselves in a similar situation,
Right.
what could we realistically even expect?
Yeah, that's a really important question.
Yeah.
And I think, this deep dive has really brought up some pretty uncomfortable truths
Yeah.
about the limits of diplomacy and the potential consequences for individuals who get caught in these really complicated situations.
So we started out just trying to understand why so many Canadians were in this Cuban prison.
We did.
And now we're grappling with these bigger questions
Yeah.
about, individual rights and the responsibility of governments to protect their citizens on this international level. It's a lot to process, to be honest.
It is. But that's the value of a deep dive like this.
Yeah.
We're not always going to find these easy solutions.
Right.
But we're forced to confront these really difficult questions and really grapple with the complexities of the situation.
But these are real people's lives.
They are.
What happens to them now? Where do we even go from here?
I think that's the question we're all left with.
Yeah.
We've learned about these harsh realities of La Condesa,
Yeah.
the complexities of these legal cases, and the concerning lack of support from the Canadian and U.S. governments.
And it all comes back to that central question we've been kind of wrestling with this whole time.
Yeah.
If countries are failing to protect their citizens abroad, who is responsible?
It's a big question.
Yeah, and it's not about, pointing fingers or placing blame.
It's not about that.
It's about trying to understand these complexities
Right.
and recognizing the potential for injustice and maybe even, starting to think about what we can even do as individuals to demand better protections for citizens who are traveling or living abroad.
Yeah.
So maybe this deep dive isn't really about finding all the answers. Maybe it's about prompting us to ask the right questions
I think so.
and to kind of stay engaged with these issues even after we're done listening,
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, these are human stories.
Yeah,
And they deserve our attention.
they do.
These are real people who found themselves caught in a system that feels stacked against them.
Yeah.
And maybe, just by learning about their experiences,
Yeah.
we can all become a little more informed,
A little more aware.
a little more aware, and maybe even a little more motivated to demand better for ourselves and for each other.
Yeah, I like that.
You know?
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to step out of La Condesa
Okay.
and back into our own lives.
Back to reality.
But hopefully, we're all walking away with a little bit of a better understanding
Yeah,
of the complexities of international relations,
for sure.
the challenges of protecting citizens abroad,
Yeah,
and the human stories that often get lost in the headlines.
absolutely.